Okay, so before our meditation, someone had a question about they'd been listening to some tapes or watching some tapes from Ram Dass and noting that uh, Ram Dass and a number of other people who were kind of deeply involved in the Enlightenment path, and many of them who are kind of regarded as teachers in the Enlightenment path, have a history of using psychedelics. So the question was kind of along the lines of are psychedelics a prerequisite for the Enlightenment path? So the short answer is no. Okay, I mean, for thousands of years, people have been practicing meditation. We've had sages in India and Tibet and in North America and Africa, really all over the world in different traditions, doing different meditative kind of approaches. Some of them have involved using plants with psychedelic properties, and a lot of them, maybe most of them, have not. So both of those things have a history. But first, to be clear, absolutely not a prerequisite. I was fortunate in my own case. Some of you've read about this in my latest book. I start with the story about this thing that happened to me when I was 11 years old, of this kind of spontaneous opening up experience of consciousness, and I had some others in childhood as well that I don't write about there, and that's happened to a lot of people. And I was not dropping acid when I was 11, 12 years old. I was dropping acid about 4 or 5 years later, and that had to do with the fact that I was an adventurous spirit, and it had to do with the fact that it was the mid '60s, and I was in California, and kind of historically, sociologically, this thing was coming into the zeitgeist. That there's these substances that can, and I was already starting to read. I was reading the Upanishads and reading the Tao Te Ching and reading the Bhagavad Gita when I was still in high school. It was like 1965, and then along come these substances, and this idea that you can have this very dramatic experience of that or something like that, something at least suggestive, if not true nirvana, something suggestive of it, something with some relationship to it. And you take this pill, and 45 minutes later, your mind opens up. Specifically, Ram Dass was closely connected with that because he was at ground zero for the psychedelic movement in America in the '60s, because before he was Ram Dass, when he was Dr. Richard Alpert, and he was a research psychologist at Harvard, and he was partnered up with another psychologist there, Timothy Leary, and Leary had gotten introduced to psychedelics in Mexico, and soon they were doing research there. They did they did one particular, the most interesting probably bit of research that they did was the Good Friday experiment, where they took a bunch of I think they were Catholic novitiates. They were priests in training, and it was Good Friday, and they had them all in a church, where they were going to be camped out. They were like on retreat for going through Good Friday into the next day, and as a double blind test, they administered LSD to half of them, and the other half got placebos, and they had them all on, I guess, Saturday, write about their experiences, and then what these different novitiate priests wrote. Their writing was given to a panel of experts on religious experience. And they weren't told, okay, who had the placebo, who had the acid. So it was a double blind test. And they were they were, ranked. Okay, who had real spiritual experiences and who was, you know, just had, nice intentions. And the ones who got the real acid all had were judges having the real spiritual experiences. So so they were doing stuff like that at Harvard. But then things started getting they started attracting attention and weird publicity, and turned out they got in some trouble for giving acid to undergraduates, and very famously Alpert and Leary got kicked out of Harvard. I think they were the first full professors to get fired from Harvard in 100 years or something like that. They started doing various things like giving talks around the country about how acid might be used. In those days, they talked about it in terms of the proper set and setting, and you always had the guide there, someone who had not taken the dose or only taken a very small dose to, remind you to let go, and so on and so forth. And and Dr. Alpert, the future Ram Dass, gave one of these talks in Los Angeles in 1965, and it was all in terms of, well, if we had acid, and if we were using LSD, and then at the end he was quietly distributing it, and some of that wound up finding its way to me. I wasn't at the lecture, but some of it found its way to me in the fall of 1965 when I was a senior in high school. And that was so that was my introduction to psychedelics, directly from the man, and so yeah, I had a couple of years, 2-3 years of where that was kind of my major form of exploration, as a lot of people did in that era, in particular, 65, 66, 67. And again, just because of, history and generations, a whole lot of the people who've become the generation of teachers, people who are around my age now in their 60s and going into their 70s, people like Sharon Salzberg and who are those people? I can't remember names anymore. Sorry. It's not the acid, it's old age. And some of the most popular kirtan singers, Krishna Das and Jayu Tal, that whole generation of people, most of them had a time of taking psychedelics. But it's not a one-to-one correspondence, I got done with that after a couple of years. A lot of people who were taking psychedelics did not continue to have they just, I met some of them who were the parents at the prep school where I taught, came back, they were at Woodstock and so forth, and then they just went back and, they became stockbrokers, and not that you couldn't be an enlightened stockbroker, but some of them, they just seemed to completely forget about that part of their lives.
So when did you have a meditative, or I don't know, spiritual experience without a drug? Right after that, because you went then into Sanskrit studies and Indian, all kinds of things. Mm-hmm. Right after that.
Yeah, I mean, some of it I was doing at that time. I mean, I was dropped out of college, but I was still, looking at reading the books, and we were. I mean, I was in the I was hitchhiking around the country, and I was in and out of the Haight-Ashbury, and the Haight-Ashbury was just a hotbed of, San Francisco, mid-60s. Again, history is important. The mid-60s, the United States loosened up their immigration laws, and that allowed the teachers to come from the East for the first time. So you had Suzuki Roshi, came from Japan and started the first full-time Zen center in San Francisco. You had Bhaktivedanta Swami, came from India, set up his first storefront Hare Krishna temple in New York City, and the second one in San Francisco on Frederick Street. I used to go there. I'd be, tripping all night in Golden Gate Park, and then in the morning I'd go up to Frederick Street and catch the sunrise chanting service at the Krishna Temple and get the free breakfast. The really good way to come down from the acid was was to go to the Hare Krishna Temple. That worked for me. So it was not either or, but at a certain point I started to realize that I was getting tired of going up and down like a yo-yo. And I started the more I paid attention to what these texts were saying and what these teachers were saying, the clearer it became that they were saying you don't need a substance. That if you do this in a serious way, not a solemn way. Solemn's not me, but in a serious way, just mean keep doing it. It's more gradual. You're not going to get hit like a a bomb in 45 minutes, but it's more incremental, but it's more solid and real, and it's without the a lot of what people may associate with psychedelics may not have anything to do with what we're talking about. There was just this piece in the New York Times, something about taking the magic out of magic mushrooms, and because there is this now psychedelic second wave now, which is with where psychedelics are being introduced sometimes in microdoses and sometimes in big doses, working with people with PTSD, war trauma, people with terminal cancer who are facing fear and anxiety about dying, and people who trying to quit smoking and so forth. And they're having a lot of success with it. And usually it's combined with talk therapy, and it's usually a series of just a couple, 2 or 3 sessions. It's not like that becomes a lifestyle, and they're having a lot of success with it. So this article is about now some researchers are saying, well, maybe we can chemically alter the psychedelics so you don't actually go through the experience of it. You don't trip, but just somehow things get chemically altered, and your depression, your PTSD, or whatever it is, goes away. And so there's this big debate as to whether that's a valid approach. But the article starts from the very first paragraph. The first couple of paragraphs are describing this guy's nightmarish trip where he took like a journey through hell, and then he saw his dead body there, and and presented it as if, well, that's what tripping means. And I have no big investment in psychedelics. That time is way years behind me now. But it made me mad because I felt that's not a fair treatment of the subject to say, okay, do we have the drug with or without the tripping, but defining the tripping as that? That was very sensationalistic, and the sensationalism is what killed it in the '60s. Tim Leary, unfortunately, who became like the public face. He became and he was a troublemaker. He really liked poking people, and wound up in prison, and then oh my God, someone's got to do the film about his life.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what finally happened for me specifically was living in the Haight-Ashbury there, where some of the public health conditions were not great, and in May or June of 1968, I came down with hepatitis.
Terrific.
Yeah. And my parents insisted that I come home. I didn't want to, but they insisted. So I came home to recuperate. And that kind of became like a kind of a watershed change moment in my life. I actually painted a self-portrait, which I have somewhere. I'm not I have zero artistic skill, but I painted looking in the mirror, I painted a portrait of myself. My skin was bright yellow from the hepatitis. My eyes were red, and my long hair down on my shoulders, my long blonde hair, and my big red beard. So that's kind of like the pivot moment of my life. So while I was there recuperating, a friend loaned me a copy of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's translation and commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. Okay, and they had they had learned TM, Transcendental Meditation, which was Maharishi's technique, which is a technique of effortless meditation. And I'd been reading the Bhagavad Gita, but not in Maharishi's translation and not with his commentary. And I had read it or misread it, as many people had over the years in the East and in the West, as saying, oh, you have to choose, if you want spirituality, if you want enlightenment, you can't have a life in the world. Essentially, you have to be a monk. And I was really, I know I want enlightenment. I know I'm here in this world for this, but I don't know about this, renouncing the whole world thing. And what Maharishi does in his translation there is he unpacks the verses verse by verse and shows, no, that's a misunderstanding. That's way too superficial. Not having a car and not having a job and not have that again, if that got you enlightened, the homeless camps here would be full of enlightened people. It's deeper than that. It's on the inside. And he presented it in terms of, okay, here's this simple, natural, effortless technique. Do it twice a day for 20 minutes, and you don't have to change your lifestyle. And people like me, and to a large degree people like Ram Dass and Tim Leary and all that, we were seeing it as a big lifestyle thing. We were the counterculture. All this counterculture stuff got mixed up with that. And so to me this was a challenge. It was like an offer I couldn't refuse. I had to try it, because I realized, oh, this is presenting the enlightenment path in a form that I can bring back to the suburbs. Like this is the one I can bring home to meet mom and dad, as it were, right? That it's that and it's like so I learned TM. Actually, my first introductory lecture on TM was at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, about a mile from the spot where I'm sitting right now, and I learned TM, and it's interesting. My brother, my younger brother, and I, we were both for a little while sleeping in the same room in our parents' house. It was in Sherman Oaks. And my brother started because he saw me waking up every morning with a smile on my face. Literally, I was just waking up blissful from this first starting this meditation. It's just the contrast was like, yeah. And I knew right away that I was going to want to be able to teach this. And again, there was this whole generation of people, mostly around my age. We were all, baby boomers. I was born 1949, so all people mostly born within 2 or 3 years of me, either way, who, Maharishi said, okay, yeah, you want to be a teacher, cut your hair, put on a necktie, go back to school and finish your degree. He said, because we're going to bring this to Western civilization and show them it's not some weirdo Eastern thing and it's not some weirdo hippie thing. So, you've got to be, used to say, straight and up to date. And it was very successful. We just really infiltrated Americans. The fact that meditation is so accepted now that, they teach meditation at every, adult evening school, and at the YMCA, and there's yoga studios and everything. That's very, very much goes back to Maharishi and TM, and his whole, and some of the people that where he was telling them, okay, go back to school. He said, and you go back and you study, a couple of them in particular. One of them, an old friend of mine, Keith Wallace. He said, you go back and get your degree in physiology and do the research to establish the physiological reality of what happens in meditation. And so Keith Wallace went back, got his PhD at UCLA, later teamed up with Herbert Benson at Harvard. And they did these pioneering studies in the late 60s, early 70s that were published in Science magazine, Scientific American, showing how, okay, during meditation, the hypometabolic, wakeful hypometabolic state, right? Basically turiya, the state where you're settled down as in sleep but wide awake to enjoy that silence. They established that, and yeah, the rest is history.
Thank you.
Sure, you
Nice.
bet. You
Mr.
bet.
O.
Yep. Any other questions about this topic or this bit of history here? Chime in, because I can't see all your faces right now. If anything you want to ask about this. But it is interesting to me now to see this second wave of psychedelic interest coming on, and I've got such kind of distance from it and just kind of going, okay, we'll see what happens here. And, they learned a lot from the first wave. So, they've been very careful of getting, government approval, just going through the institutions and doing studies and demonstrating the efficacy and not letting it become part of culture wars or so forth. So
I would suggest, just if anybody's interested to further their information, Michael Pollan's book called How to Change Your Mind.
Yeah.
Really worth reading. It's really
I like Michael Pollan a lot. He's a really good writer, and I think he's really very careful and fair-minded, and he's not selling anything. He's
all of his books are good.
Yeah,
in my opinion.
Yeah. We have to say the other thing about the chemicals is because they work so quickly and they are so powerful that sometimes people do have bad trips. Sometimes people do have hellish trips. My last trip was hellish. It was shortly before I came down with hepatitis, and it was like nature was conspiring to get me to move on, I think. I won't bore you with the whole story, but I wound up having to walk across town, walk across San Francisco, and across the Haight-Ashbury, across Haight Street, when it was at its height of, hippie freakdom, as I was peaking on the acid. And it was like walking, for those of you who know your art history, it was like walking through a Hieronymus Bosch hell. It was definitely the hardest walking I've ever done. I mean, it was definitely working overtime to take each step. But this is a long time. This is, in a galaxy far, far away. There's a line in Shakespeare, I think it's in Othello. Someone asks some character about an affair that he had with some woman somewhere, and he tells the story, and he concludes, he says, "But that was in another country, and besides, the wench is dead." It's like, that's That's gone. But it was, I know in my case, it was very helpful that I had already had some of these opening experiences before encountering psychedelics, so that I knew experientially it's, it doesn't come from the psychedelics. It doesn't depend on them. Here's the two stories. The two key stories about this. One of them is from so when Ram Dass, he's still Richard Alpert, and he starts reaching the end of the end of the psychedelic trail, as I did. Took him a few more years. It was no, right around the same time. I think it was around 1969. So he goes to India, and he figures, well, they've got all these gurus here. They've got all these sages here. I got to find my guru, find the sage who's going to show me the way to do this without psychedelics, who's going to put psychedelics in their place for me. And he checks out this holy man and that holy man, and no one is really doing it for him. And then he's brought to meet Neem Karoli Baba, who, if you read his seminal book Be Here Now, he refers to him there as Maharaji. Maharaji is like what you would call your guru or your uncle or your revered father or grandfather. He was, because Maharaji had told him, Neem Karoli Baba told him, don't tell people about me, don't spill the beans. So he just calls him Maharaji in that book. In later books he gives his name. So he's brought to meet Neem Karoli Baba. Oh, and the story is the night before he had been he was traveling in a jeep with another American, and they'd been stopped. They were camped out in the middle of a field or something, and he went out under the stars to take a piss. And while he was there, he started thinking about his mother, who had recently died of cancer of the spleen, which makes your abdomen gets very distended. And then went back to sleep, forgot about that. The next day they travel a couple hundred more miles. They meet Neem Karoli Baba for the first time, and Baba is sitting on his cot as usually was wrapped in a plaid blanket, as he always was, no shirt. Older, kind of big, fat man, bald, fat man. And Ram Dass, he's still Richard Alpert at this point. He's kind of hanging back in the back of the little crowd around Neem Karoli Baba. And at a certain point, Baba kind of picks him out, and he brings him forward. And they start chatting through a translator, right, because Maharaji didn't speak English. And he looks at him, he says, suddenly he says to Alpert, "You were under the stars last night." Alpert says, "Yeah, right, that's easy, sure." And then he says, "You were thinking about your mother." He says, "Yeah." He says, and all this he's saying in Hindi, it's being translated. He said, "She died." "Yeah." "Before she died, she got very big in the belly." "Yeah." And then he pulls Alpert by the beard, pulls him right up next to his face, and he says one word in English. He says, "Spleen." Right. And Alpert goes, "Oh," and he starts crying. And as he says, and I've heard him tell this story a couple of times, and he says, "I wasn't crying because I was sad. I wasn't crying because I was happy. I was crying because I was home. I knew this was my guy. I knew this was the guy who saw me inside and out and saw, all my worst thoughts and everything, and loved me anyway. And I knew I was home. This was my teacher." So then he starts hanging around Neem Karoli Baba's ashram. and everything's great. Ah, at last I found my teacher. I can stop going up and down like a yo-yo, taking all this acid and all that. But then he starts, after a few days, he starts getting these doubts. But what about acid? He hasn't addressed, I still, this is, being with him is so powerful. But man, acid, and Alpert had taken thousands of trips. I took dozens of trips. He took thousands of trips. And, he said, that stuff was powerful. I need it to be contextualized, put in its place. And he's having these thoughts, and he suddenly gets the word, Baba wants to see you. Maharaji wants to see you. Come. So Maharaji, he goes around to see Maharaji. Maharaji says, through the translator, you have some pills in your Jeep? And he says, yeah, and he comes and he brings, he's got like a cigar box full of various, medicines and vitamins and all that. And he thinks, oh, the guru's kind of old. He needs some, he starts giving him vitamins. And he says, no, the power medicine, the power. He said, you mean LSD? Yeah, LSD. And Alpert had some special, triple dose extra strength tabs of acid made up for the trip to India. And so he gives one to Maharaji, and Maharaji goes, no, more, give me all of them. And he gives him like a handful of these, and Maharaji takes them and downs them all. And Alpert thinks, well, this is going to be interesting. And he sits and he checks his watch and he waits to see what happens. And you know what happens? Nothing happens. Nothing happens. And when I've heard Ram Dass tell that story, he concludes with, I have no further information on this. But I'll tell you my theory, my way of understanding it. If I take a cup of hot tea and I, rude enough to toss it at you, you're going to feel it. But if you're sitting in a hot tub and I take a cup of hot tea and I fling it at you, it's nothing. Right? Maharaji was in that place of enlightenment where, fine, the effect of some drug is just one more thing coming and going within the sky of infinite awareness, infinite beingness. So I think that's the controlling story. There's another story about this, but we're out of time. So remind me another time to tell you the other story about putting psychedelics in their place. Okay, so thank you, everybody. May all beings swiftly realize what they've been all along, boundless beingness, boundless happiness. How did they ever forget? How did we ever forget? May we all remember swiftly, and thus may peace prevail everywhere. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Dean. Very interesting.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dean. That was a good night.
Good.
Very interesting. Yeah.
My mushrooms right away.
Wait, say it again, Barbara.
Gonna run off and get my mushrooms right away.
Okay. Yeah. The old war stories. My older brother used to say he was a veteran of the acid wars.
You've come a long way.
See ya. Enjoy being.